I want to thank one of our sponsors, The Peddler in El Sobrante, for its support for the tour. The Peddler is owned by my longtime friend and garden tour host, Jeff Jergy. Some of you may have been to Jeff's beautiful local native plant garden in Pinole, or perhaps you have been to The Peddler and seen the native plant garden that Jeff has planted outside its store. So now a word from The Peddler. The Peddler is proud to be your local bike shop, offering enthusiasts in the San Francisco Bay Area a comprehensive selection of quality bikes and gear, and service and repair for your bike when it needs it. Shop online or visit The Peddler. However you ride, The Peddler is here to meet your cycling needs. You can call them at 510-222-3420 or visit them online at theped.com. Now, in this segment, we'll be seeing beautiful photographs of native plants and hearing stories about the creatures that visit them in our own local version of Tiny World. So this is May. May Chen is a volunteer with the Friends of Sausal Creek. This presentation was created by May, who took all these amazing photographs, identified the insects, and knows their stories. The presentation is narrated by garden tour host and entomologist Clytia Curley. Some of you may have been to Clytia and Joe's beautiful garden in Trestle Glen in past years. The Friends of Sausal Creek work to restore, maintain, and protect the Sausal Creek watershed, which is located in Oakland. Through the Friends, an army of volunteers work to remove invasive non-native species, plant native plants grown in their native plant nursery, control erosion, pick up trash, and more. One of the Friends' many successful projects has been the creation of a pollinator garden. So let's go now and see what's been happening in the garden in Oakland and could be happening in yours. So Clytia, are you with us?
I am with you, but I don't see me.
I see you.
We can see you just fine.
I see you just fine. So Clytia, will you tell us about your background screen?
Can you make me so I can see myself? That would be helpful. But anyway, I guess my background screen is, I know what oh, there I am, thank you. My background screen is actually of the Bridgeview Pollinator Garden in Oakland, which is very close to where I live and where it happens to be raining right now.
All right, so let me remind people that if you have questions for Clytia about the plants or insects that you'll be seeing, I hope that you will type them into the Q&A or the chats. And Clytia, before we start with May's photos and stories, do you have any impressions of your own that you would like to share about native plants and insects?
Well, you know, I just want to say, first of all, that I have been so excited this morning to hear all these insect-centric talks. I have been here from the get-go this morning, and it's been really wonderful. And I'm especially happy, given that, to share May's photos and stories that are mainly about pollinators, and they're going to be mainly about bees and flies, which we haven't seen a whole lot of yet. So I think that will be a good addition to the insect story.
Okay, good. Well, with that, Clytia, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, I will share my screen. And yeah, whoops, there it was. Okay. So this picture was taken in 2011 and was provided by Kathleen Harris. She's one of the founding volunteers of the Bridgeview Pollinator Garden. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. At that time, the spot was an abandoned dump site for the city of Oakland, and it was capped with clay and basically left to let anything colonize it. When the Friends made the decision to restore the space, and specifically to attract bees and other pollinators, the area looked like this, a sea of non-native and invasive weeds. 2021 marks the 10th anniversary of the Pollinator Garden. And it's through the perseverance and the hard work of volunteers of the Friends that this weedy patch has now been transformed into a haven for native plants and wildlife, some of which May describes in this presentation. So it's situated on a flat spot high above Sausal Creek in Oakland, and the garden is thriving despite many ongoing challenges. And I'm just to talk about a little bit about those to start. It's exclusively run by volunteers still, including scout groups and seniors and families from the community. There's a lot of work has been done, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Tireless volunteers help plant and weed. They stake plants and install wire cages against deer browse and many other things. 10 years on, volunteers are still in the process of clearing a huge patch of Himalayan blackberry and controlling English ivy. The Friends is recently back to scheduling 2 Sundays a month for volunteer work at the garden. So I hope you will think about maybe coming by. Reservations are going to be required due to COVID restrictions, but one of these days we'll be back to normal. But it is possible to volunteer there now. Most of the plants are provided by the Friends native plant nursery, and many are also provided by volunteers from their own gardens. The garden, as I said, faces major challenges. The soil was compacted clay, very questionable and mysterious drainage. It took 2 years of mulching before anything at all would grow. There's no water on site, which means that during planting time, volunteers cart in water in gallon jugs. They water young plants through the first 2 dry seasons, and after that, the plants are on their own. This tough love approach selects for the most resilient and drought-tolerant natives. And by now, we have many hardy plants coming back year after year that delight visitors and volunteers alike. Speaking of challenges, I'm sure many of you have faced challenges in doing your own, restoring your own gardens to natives, and we always like to hear stories. So if you want to share in the chat, that'd be a great thing to be able to do. About 3 years ago, May started observing and photographing insects in the garden through the seasons. Instead of taking you on a garden tour, I'm going to share a few of the photos and videos that May took throughout 2020, along with her wonderful descriptions. You've heard about this plant in a couple of other talks. This is the pink flowering currant, and it's the earliest blooming plant in the garden. It begins to bloom as early as January. It provides wonderfully for bumblebees, which are social insects. They overwinter as queens, and the queens are born and mated the previous year, and when they come out and emerge from their hibernation, they have to establish new colonies on their own. I think it was Doug who mentioned these already this morning. These single moms need all the nectar and pollen resources they can find, so it's really good to have an early source for them in this plant. Purple nightshade is an interesting plant. It has its pollen hidden securely in the anthers that form a yellow anther cone you see in this picture in the middle of the nodding flower. Only a few bees have access to this pollen. Bumblebees, carpenter bees, and some digger bees have the ability to decouple the flight muscles from their wings, and they rapidly vibrate those muscles, and you can see what's happening. You can see the vibrations actually in the top as well. It actually knocks the pollen out of little holes in the anther cone and onto the belly of the bee. This is obviously a poppy with a mining bee. Mining bees are some of the first bees to appear in early spring. Here is a bee collecting pollen, and it's gathered into special hairs on the leg, the scopy. You can tell this is a female bee because males don't collect pollen to provision their nests, nor do they have the pollen collecting equipment. So if you see a bee laden with pollen like that, you know she's a female. This little sweat bee has been busy gathering pollen from a poppy as well. Poppy flowers don't produce nectar, but they do make lots of pollen, so they are a good resource for that. About the size of a grain of rice, a masked bee is gathering pollen here from the protruding anthers of blue-eyed grass, which is actually a kind of iris. Surprisingly, these small flowers also attract much larger bees, like our bumblebees. Its tongue extended right there You can see a hoverfly sampling a pollen mass on blue-eyed grass. Hoverflies are called, they're called hoverflies because they have a habit of sort of hovering, then darting somewhere else, and then hovering again. A lot of species of hoverfly, oops, sorry, I'll stay on this one. Many species of hoverflies mimic bees and wasps in appearance, sporting yellow and black bands on their abdomens, but they have no stinger, so you don't need to worry about them. I'm thinking probably many of you have seen flies of this sort and thought that they were bees. We have wasp mimics as well, so they can be tricky. Here's another hoverfly that's a bee mimic. Flies are in the group Diptera, which means 2 wings. Other flying insects have 4. And in the middle of the slide, we've circled that hind wing, which is reduced to a little paddle, which is basically used to aid in balance during flight. Unbeknownst to many gardeners, hoverflies are excellent pollinators, and adult flies are often found around flowers, feeding on nectar and pollen. Now, this is not a pollinator, of course. This narrow-leaf milkweed is infested with aphids. We heard these aphids referred to in an earlier talk because when you grow milkweed, you're going to get these aphids. They're doing what they do best, which is reproducing. The bright yellow aphids with black appendages are the oleander aphid, and as the name suggests, they do indeed feed on oleander as well as milkweed. This is an all-female species. There are no males known. The females reproduce by giving live birth to clones of themselves. And you can see the adult in the middle of the picture, a little baby nymph popping out. They give live birth. And even stranger, the aphid nymphs are born with their own offspring already developing inside them. So these guys can reproduce incredibly rapidly. So it's no wonder that large aphid colonies seem to appear overnight. I'm sure you've all had that experience. So speaking of aphids and hoverflies, here we come together. The larvae of some hoverflies, which is being pointed at with this arrow, are important predators of garden pests, including aphids and many other soft-bodied insects. The larvae are blind, legless, and slug-like, and here an aphid is being raised up into the air, grasped by the larva, and its body contents are being drained. Adult flies, the hoverflies that we saw earlier, often lay their eggs near aphid colonies to ensure that the larvae will have plenty to eat. Hoverfly larva can eat up to 500 aphids over its lifetime. When you see this many aphids, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but there are a lot of hoverfly larvae out there. So given that the adults are such great pollinators and these guys are voracious feeders on aphids, what is not to love about a hoverfly? Here is a tachinid fly taking a break on a tidy tips after a rain shower. The females of these flies lay eggs on other insects, and their larvae develop as internal parasites of the host. Fast and frenetic, this digger bee is a photographer's despair, says May. May was lucky to get a shot of this bee foraging on rock Phacelia. It's a female, as you can see by the pollen packed into those hairs on the leg, on the scoping. Remember, male bees don't collect pollen to provision for the young, nor do they have pollen collecting equipment. This is a hooker's evening primrose being visited by a carpenter bee. The hooker's evening primrose has large pollen grains that are strung on sticky cobwebby strands. Not many bees can make use of this pollen or are able to collect it without getting immobilized. Our carpenter bees, which are among the largest in the garden, are one of the few that really excel at this job. And they are the major daytime pollinators of the primrose. So she got away. At night, the flowers are reportedly pollinated by moths. Here's a picture of a honeybee on Globe Gilia. She's carrying her load of pollen in her saddlebags here. here and here, the blue pollen. The pollen is taken on a darker hue because it's been mixed with nectar and saliva while being packed in there, and will be transported back to the nest. So this is a funny little picture. On early mornings in late May, we begin to see these shiny metallic insects with their hind ends sticking out of monkey flowers. And May has peeled back part of the flower to catch this insect asleep inside of the flower. You see, this is something called a small-headed fly. Indeed, it has a small head, but that is the common name of the fly. And that fly is resting inside of the flower. The larvae of these flies are internal parasites of spiders. They're rare, but they can be very locally abundant. And May says she sees them every year when the sticky monkey flowers are in bloom. The adult flies have long sucking mouth parts, and so they can access the nectar at the base of the flower. Their whole life seems to revolve around the plant, feeding, mating, resting. I have looked for these guys in my garden and have not found any, so I guess they're not locally abundant in my garden. If you take a look at how the fly is positioned, you see it's very well situated to receive pollen from the anthers that are above here. And she's already all, he, don't know, dusted with pollen. These are very effective pollinators for sticky monkey flower. The flowers of bee plant are very small and inconspicuous, but they do produce a lot of nectar, which is much sought after by many insects. In this picture, we see a bumblebee that's too big to enter the flower, a yellow-faced bumblebee, but she has a long tongue and can reach the nectar at the base. Here's a mining bee on the same sort of flower. She's small enough to slip in and out of the bee plant flowers. And besides taking nectar, she will also be collecting pollen. Here's a yellow-faced bumblebee taking nectar from coyote mint. These tight clusters of flowers are also very attractive to butterflies. Mason bees have their pollen collecting hairs, the scopa, on the underside of the abdomen. The bee walks over the anthers, lightly and rapidly tapping her abdomen on them, and then with a quick swiping motion of her hind legs, secures the pollen onto the hairs on her belly. Here is another mason bee collecting pollen on a tidy tips flower head. As with other blooms in the sunflower family, what appears to be a single flower is actually a composite of dozens of florets held on the same flower head. So here are the ray flowers, and here are the flowers where pollen is being produced. And you can see a lot of golden pollen here on the belly of this mason bee. Here's a female longhorn bee gathering pollen on elegant tarweed. Note the huge load of pollen here on her scopy, on her hind leg. The pollen grains are held there loosely by electrostatic forces between the hairs until the bee returns to her nest. And here's a great view of her from behind, showing those big loads of pollens on her hind legs. Longhorn bees specialize on flowers in the sunflower family, and they're quick and efficient. Here's another one on elegant tarweed, gathering huge loads of pollen into her scopy in a matter of seconds. Here she goes. Also on tarweed, this wide striped sweat bee is one of the largest and easily recognizable bees in the garden. It's about the size of a honeybee, so somewhat bigger than many of the smaller solitary bees. Here's that same sweat bee. They are generalist species visiting a wide variety of flowers, but they really seem to love the elegant tarweed. These bees are more slow and methodical in their foraging behavior as pollen is collected onto the hind legs. Tarweed, again, is in the sunflower family, and the flower head is composed of numerous small flowers, and that's where she is collecting. During each stop, the bee can conveniently gather lots of pollen from these many flowers. Male bees are sometimes easy to distinguish from the females because of their longer antennae. This is a male sweat bee, and he's taking time off to groom an antenna. He has, here's the antenna here. They have special structures on their front legs for this job. A Lorcan's admiral stops to sip nectar from the lilac verbena. With small, tubular, tightly clustered flowers, the plant is a butterfly magnet. In one sitting, a butterfly can access nectar from multiple flowers with its long, flexible mouth parts that are coiled when not feeding. The plant enjoys a long blooming period, flowering from early spring through fall. And May recommends that every gardener who wants to attract butterflies to his or her garden should plant several of these verbena. And Jen and Dan, we just heard, also highly recommended verbena as a butterfly flower. So if any of you guys who are listening plant verbena, or maybe you have another native plant that in your experience is well loved by butterflies, we'd love to hear about it in the chat. On a cluster of lilac verbena, a white female crab spider, here she is, has caught a honeybee as big as itself. Crab spiders are ambush predators that like to sit and wait for prey on flowers. Here's a little mason bee reaching in deep for nectar on a black sage flower. On this same black sage, a black-tailed bumblebee was too busy foraging to notice the danger and has been snagged by a crab spider. So here's the crab spider. Crab spiders have potent venom that quickly immobilizes their prey. When I was a younger entomologist and out collecting, which I don't do anymore, I used to occasionally see bees immobilized on plants, and almost always it was because there was a spider that had grabbed it, a crab spider. So it's an occupational hazard for bees. The small tripartite sweat bee is one of the most common bees in the garden. Here is one collecting pollen from a trying to get it going. Well, I can't seem to show that video, sorry. Oh, there it goes. Collecting pollen from a Clytia flower. Gathering pollen is a whole body workout for this little bee. She curls her body around individual anthers one at a time, scraping with her legs. And then the purplish pollen is packed into the scopy on the hind legs. I think you can see that there. Male longhorn bees don't collect pollen for the young, nor do they participate in nest construction, but they do delight gardeners with their endearing habit of sleeping in aggregations every night, usually on the same flower or vegetation. In the garden, they seem to favor one particular sneezeweed seed head for their nightly roost. And I know Kathy is now fond of this kind of picture. Many other insects also seem to enjoy the sneezeweed for their rest. This is a tachinid fly, a perky, wide-eyed fly who is actually asleep. Oops. It's a tachinid. I showed you another tachinid earlier. These are flies that parasitize other insects. So this is a species that mimics both parasitic wasps, both in appearance and also in behavior. Here's a buckeye butterfly taking nectar from narrow leaf milkweed flowers. So a lot of gardeners are now planting milkweeds for monarchs and their caterpillars, but actually milkweed flowers are a great source of nectar for all kinds of insects: bees, wasps, flies, bugs, beetles. Again, here we have small, tightly clustered flowers offering lots of nectar, all the features that are especially attractive to butterflies. One of the most easily identified bees in the garden, the faithful leafcutter bee, has beautiful black and gold bands on its abdomen. Like most leaf cutters, it has a habit of tipping its abdomen up while gathering pollen onto special hairs of its belly, which I had shown you before. You may have seen some of the round holes that these bees make in foliage, such as rose leaves they seem to be fond of, and other soft-leaved ornamentals. And I'm just wondering if it might change the way you think about this damage to know that it's a native pollinator that using leaves to make her nest. I was going to ask you to give a thumbs up in the chat, but we don't seem to have those that feature here. But anyway, I'll give her a thumbs up. A male sweat bee is sipping nectar from nude buckwheat flowers. Note the very long antennae that is typical of many male bees. Wherever there are bees, there are bee wolves. As its name implies, the bee wolf is a predator that captures and paralyzes paralyzes bees to feed its young. Being a good source of nectar, the buckwheat is a great hunting ground for these little wasps. Another bee peril lurking among the buckwheat flowers is this bizarre-looking leucospid wasp that parasitizes the larvae of solitary bees. This thing that we are pointing to here is the ovipositor with which she lays eggs. It has been curled up around the back. And when she straightens out the ovipositor on her tippy toes and gets it at a 90-degree angle, she can bore through wood with that ovipositor and insert eggs into bee larvae that are living in the wood. The masked bee is the smallest identified bee in the garden. It doesn't have any external anatomical structures for collecting pollen like the hairy legs or the hairy bellies or the pollen baskets that we've seen on other bees. Instead, both pollen and nectar are stored in an internal compartment of the digestive tract for transporting to the nest. Note the yellow markings on the bee's face that help identify it as a masked bee. Before May recorded this video of the Grindelia flowers at close range, she said she hadn't realized how fast the bee moves its mouthparts and its front legs to gather pollen. A yellow jacket wasp? It's actually another hoverfly, and this time mimicking a yellow jacket. This species flies in late summer into fall and is often found taking nectar on coyote brush. Here's a tiny unidentified fly visiting female flowers of coyote brush as well. Underappreciated as pollinators, flies are second only to bees as providers of this essential ecological service. A wide-eyed California jumping spider greets the camera upside down on goldenrod flowers. These little jumpers don't catch prey using silk webs. They're stalkers that pounce on their prey, laying down a safety line before making the leap. They have excellent eyesight. Spiders, of course, are among the predators that keep our insect populations in check and are an integral part of a healthy garden. This brings us to the end of the tour of the Bridgeview garden as it was seen in 2020. And now spring is in full swing in 2021. The Friends of Sausal Creek invites you to visit anytime to join in tending the garden if you can. Scheduled work days are posted on the Friends website as they continue to adhere to COVID requirements. And last, I just want to show you for reference here the plants listed alphabetically by common name and the insects associated with them that May's included in this presentation. These are only a fraction of the many plants and animals living in this thriving community. Okay, so we are done. I will stop sharing.
Okay, so Clytia, thank you. That was fantastic. I've seen a lot of people commenting on the chat streams about the photographs and the presentation. So thank you for narrating, and thank you, May, for putting it together. I have to say that when I was talking with May about this presentation and saw the photo of the bachelor longhorn beetles sleeping together, having a slumber party on the dried flowers of the sneezeweed, I thought I'd never seen anything so adorable in my life. Every time I see that photo,
It's changed your gardening habits.
It did. I want to see bees sleeping in my yard. So let's see, we have just about a minute. So a couple questions. Here's a quick one, like roughly where is Bridgeview located?
Okay, so if you know Park Boulevard, which is a major thoroughfare through Oakland, goes down from Montclair down to 580. It is on the south side, a little bit up the hill from Park Boulevard. So in the Oakmore area of Oakland.
Okay, so you have 2 Sundays a month that people can volunteer and they can find the information on the Friends of Sausal Creek website.
Yes.
Okay, and so I think that you would agree with me that the best thing that people can do for insects is to stop using insecticides and pesticides in their gardens. Is that?
That certainly is critical, because besides killing what you don't want, you kill a lot of what you do want. So yes, best not to use the pesticides. And mostly they're not necessary. Certainly in a native plant garden, I think they're not.
They are not. I have to say, I have not used garden chemicals for 30 years, and we were just living out of our house for 10 months. So our garden was untended, unwatered, unpruned, unweeded. It was everything for 10 months. And we moved back in. It still looks great, really.
Benign neglect. It's good.
Yep. Okay, so Clytia, I want to thank you and thank May, and we will move on now to our last but not least presentation of the day.